Kia ora, Tefano. Markie here again, back for part 2 of the gripping story of neurodiversity, neurodivergence, whichever one. So to recap very briefly, neurodiversity is a very broad term that applies to lots of things. What it means is different brain or different neurology. And the way that I use it is in a slightly more specific way to the way that it can be more broadly used, and I use it to describe a cluster of specific conditions which we went through before. Now, a couple of things that I want to clear up, having re-listened to that video, there are a few things I thought might be a little bit misleading or a bit confusing, because one of the things that I said in there was that I'm not an expert on any of these things, but I've done extensive work with people with these conditions, so that might alarm some people. It should alarm you. If you notice that as a good sign, you should have reported me to somebody. But please be reassured, I have worked extensively with people with neurodiverse conditions, but not working with the condition, if that makes sense. So, for example, I've done a lot of work in gender identity, and autism is very, very common. We'll cover that later. So I work with lots of people with ADHD, because in sexual harm and addiction, ADHD is a big factor, big background factor. And again, we'll get into that because that's very interesting. So I'm not an expert. I have a strong interest in it, and I suffer from a number of these conditions myself, and I'm going to talk about the main ones. I'm not going to go into great depth about what the symptoms are and what they all involve. What I want to do really is bust some of the myths around them. So I'm going to break them down a little bit, demystify them, and kind of clear up some of the misnomers and the misunderstandings around them, and talk about some of the particularly interesting factors that relate to those things. And I'll be relating some of that to my personal experience as well. So that is what we will be doing. Okay, so where shall we start? Let's start with ADHD. That's a good place to start. Interesting, because I think ADHD is a bit of a misnomer. I don't think it really should be called ADHD. The very name is misleading. It's misleading on two levels, really. One is, so what it stands for is Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. So, well, I guess if you take the word disorder, then it's misleading on three levels. Three things wrong with the term ADHD, but I guess we're kind of probably stuck with it. So the first thing I take issue with is the H. Okay, and when I write this down, you might see this on some of my written material, the text that's below the video, is I usually put the H in brackets, because not all ADHD involves hyperactivity. So there are three types essentially. There are more types depending on what system you use and what you go into and who you listen to. But there are classically three types of ADHD. There is the hyperactive, which is hyperactive, as you can imagine. There is the inattentive, which is what I am, and there's the combined, so both hyperactive and inattentive. I wish I was hyperactive sometimes. I'm quite the opposite in many ways. I sometimes say I have attention deficit underactivity disorder. So the other thing that is misleading or unhelpful about attention deficit disorder is it sounds like so deficit means a shortage of. So it sounds like you've got a shortage of attention. You only get so much attention allotted to you. Everyone gets 50 grams of attention per week. People with ADHD or ADD or however you want to call it, they get 2 grams of attention per week. This is where it gets a bit more nuanced and complicated. People with ADHD don't necessarily have difficulty paying attention. What they have a difficulty with is shifting attention from one thing to another, and they get bored very, very, very easily. I mentioned earlier on the previous video that some of these conditions come with superpowers, and ADHD comes with a few superpowers in a way. The first being something called hyperfocus. So if somebody with ADHD is into something, it will be quite difficult probably to get their attention. So if there is something that they enjoy, they'll go deeply into it. And you might think they're listening to you. This is something that comes up in relationships a lot. You know, the partner's chatting away to the partner with ADHD, thinks they're listening, and of course they haven't taken in a word, and then that comes out later when you said, you remember we were going to see Adhd tonight, and they say, no, we've never talked about that. So it's not so much that they're not interested, it's just that they're not there. You have to make sure, if your partner is, or you're talking to someone with ADHD, you have to make sure you've got their attention from the start. Don't start talking to them kind of assuming you've got their attention. Get their attention first, make sure you've got their attention, then talk to them. And keep it interesting, keep it snappy. So ADHD has that superpower. ADHD is also something that helps people in certain job roles. There are certain job roles that really suit people with ADHD, and they are things like police, fire service, those kinds of things. And I reckon my personal unresearched opinion is that nearly all stand-up comedians have got ADHD. And I think if you haven't got ADHD, that's a serious disability in the world of comedy. I think actually comedians tend to have quite a lot of conditions. Maybe we'll do another video on that, because that's something that I talk about as comedy coaching. So we might cover the neuroses and the conditions of comedians in another section. So and one of the reasons I think they're comedians, and often other kinds of performers as well, it's much wider, and creative people, is they think very differently. They make links in their mind in a different way to somebody that's neurotypical. Neurotypical is the opposite of neurodiverse. So neurotypical is kind of like normal. That's like a muggle type word for people who aren't in the neurodiverse club. So that is a kind of a very quick overview of ADHD. So what else would be good to talk about? So what I would suggest, if you're interested in these different conditions, is look at some other sources. There's loads of information out there that will in a very linear, straightforward, sensible, grown-up way will list all the symptoms one by one. Yes, addiction. As I alluded to, addiction and sex offences. Okay, so please don't go away from this thinking that all people with ADHD are sex offenders, or that all people with ADHD are addicts. But one of the things with ADHD is you have very low dopamine levels. And when you've got very low dopamine levels, you generally just feel a bit of shit, really. And you're constantly looking for something to raise those dopamine levels. And this is really interesting. This is a phenomenon known as poking the bear. For those of you that are interested in retroactive jealousy, we talk about poking the bear with that as well. I think often ADHD and retroactive jealousy cross over. So poking the bear is, if you can imagine, a bear, a particularly large, grizzled one, kind of sleeping soundly on a rug in the corner. And if you don't bother it, it won't bother you. So the most foolish thing you could possibly do would be to go up to that bear and poke it. Because it would then awake and eat you. But that is what people with ADHD do all the time. They pick fights, they cause trouble. They're not usually aware of this. It's a very unconscious process, and I've certainly been aware that I've done this a lot in the past. And it's not that they particularly enjoy the trouble that ensues, because nobody really does, but it's actually better than the boredom that they were experiencing before. So they're niggling away at things. So somebody with ADHD might kind of pick up on some tiny little thing and weave it into an argument, into a big bust up. And then they won't say, oh, well, I'm happy now, that's given me what I want. But they will probably feel a lot better. And their brains at least will be functioning better, even if they don't feel great. because one of the things that low dopamine causes is what they call poor executive function. So that's the kind of part of your brain that organises you in the moment. So people with ADHD can be very scatty. They'll forget things. They'll lose their car keys. All those kinds of things. So addiction and sexual harm or sexual offences kind of follow the same logic really as the poking the bear, in that somebody with ADHD will be craving the dopamine that they need in order to just function and feel okay. And often they will crave that. They will need extremes in order to give themselves that. So often that will lead to quite extreme behaviour in all different forms. It can be a big factor in full-blown addictions, but I think that ADHD also causes what I would call pseudo-addictions. And this is where I can kind of talk from personal experience, is that I've been working in the addiction field for a long time, and I recognise some addictive tendencies in myself, and actually worked on them with 12-step groups. See my other video on 12-step groups. But as time went on, I began to realise that I didn't quite fit the pattern of an addict, mainly in the sense that I was kind of more lightweight than most addicts. Is that, you know, I could be addictive, but when it got a bit too uncomfortable, I would stop. Whereas the classic addict kind of goes way beyond the kind of the comfort level. And I realised that basically I have a number of compulsive stroke addictive traits, but they're all attempts for me to raise my dopamine. And now, I wouldn't say that I never have those. I crave food an awful lot, but I've added some sort of personal measures, things like diet and lifestyle to help with dopamine, which I think have helped to an extent. So things like motivation, starting things, finishing things, and attention to detail. So somebody with ADHD fills in a form, they're probably going to leave gaps in it. There's probably going to be, if it's a tick box thing, some questions will be likely to be missing. They don't make very good kind of clerical administrative office workers. Terrible, and I've been terrible in those kind of roles. Sex offending. Okay, this is kind of an interesting one. We're probably this is a field that I'm working in at the moment. I'm doing lots of work at the moment in terms of people that harm people sexually for various number of reasons. And one of the things that can be behind an interest in child exploitation material, which is a new phrase for child porn, because it kind of tells it how it is people may potentially not be classically paedophilic in their sexual orientation, but they will use pornography and seek out more and more extremes of pornography, including things like child pornography or child exploitation material, not necessarily because of the sexual hit that it gives them, but because of the adrenaline hit and the excitement and the dopamine release that it gives them. And I'm thinking more and more that ADHD is behind a lot of people that have difficulties with their sexual behaviour. Not necessarily criminal, not necessarily harmful, but extreme sexual behaviour. Lots of people with ADHD, there's a higher incidence of people with ADHD get sexually transmitted diseases, because they're more kind of gung-ho, and they like the excitement of not taking risks, and that's one of the factors behind there. So risk-taking, excitement-seeking people. So that is a quick overview of ADHD. I'm looking at the clock and this video is getting too long, so I need to stop. So we'll go into a part 3 and we'll start talking about some of the other conditions. And what I may do is just briefly return to ADHD and touch on a few other points. So I will catch you later. Rangimarie.